We have Jason Geffner here with end-to-end analysis of a domain-generating algorithm malware family. And let's give it up for Jason, guys.
All right, thank you, everybody. My name is Jason Geffner. I'm a senior security researcher with CrowdStrike, where my job is to reverse engineer malware and exploits that have been developed by nation-state adversaries and organized crime groups. I also do intelligence research to try to attribute this malware, these exploits, tools, and C2 protocols to unique actors. Before I joined CrowdStrike, I was a principal security consultant with NGS. And before that, I was a reverse engineer on Microsoft's anti-malware team, where I was the owner of the malicious software removal tool. And today, I'm here to talk with you about a unique domain-generating algorithm malware family. Now, most modern malware communicates with attackers' servers. Typical bots, remote access tools, and downloaders connect to hard-coded server addresses or a list of addresses. And the reason is, they have many reasons to do this. They may communicate with a C2 server to try to get the next instructions from the attacker's server to execute. Or they may reach out to a download server to download more malware to run on the infected computer. But because these traditional malware samples use these hard-coded server addresses, they can be easily blacklisted by network engineers. Domain-generating algorithm malware, though, is different. DGA malware doesn't use hard-coded server addresses. Instead, DGA malware uses server addresses that are dynamically generated at runtime, allowing for a potentially unlimited number of potential server addresses. So what might this look like? Let's look at an example. Let's say that we have an example piece of malware where every minute the malware tries to connect to a different server address. Now let's say the algorithm for this DGA is that every minute it tries to connect to the server address with the numeric month, numeric day, year, hour, minute.com. So in about 10 minutes, this example malware would try to connect to 0731131430.com. Now what the attacker would do is they would choose a strike time and then register that given domain usually 24 to 48 hours before that strike time hits. Strike time hits, the malware reaches out, connects to the attacker's domain, does whatever it needs to do, and then maybe an hour or two after that strike time, the attacker will then take down their domain or redirect it and take down the server. Now, this approach makes it impossible for security researchers to predict the next server communication, and it raises the bar for sinkholing efforts. It also makes historical analysis extremely difficult. And if you think about traditional malware, it might communicate with one or two hard-coded server addresses. And if we're going to do historic whois research on those addresses, it's not too hard to say, who were all the registrants for this domain in the whois history over the past year. But there are 525,600 minutes in a year. And with this example, that would mean that we'd have to look at 500,000 whois records historically, which is really not practical. So DGA malware can definitely be challenging for a security researcher to handle. Now DGA malware, though, it's not exactly a new thing. Back in early 2008, Kraken was one of the first malware families to use a DGA. And a few months later, Configure was first discovered, also using a DGA. But DGAs haven't been restricted just to Kraken and Configure. Torpig and Sreesby are two other malware families that have also been known to use DGAs. Now in 2010, academia started to do some research on this and they published a white paper. And last year, Damballa released a white paper on 6 malware families that use DGAs. But today I'm here to talk with you about a new malware family, a unique one, and the end-to-end analysis that we did on it. So a few months ago, in February, we had the CISO of a major American financial services company email us and say, hey, CrowdStrike, we just received a suspicious looking exe attachment to an email coming into our networks. And this firm's CISO actually worked with his global cyber intelligence partner, competitor of ours, and they actually couldn't figure out what it was doing because it was obfuscated. And actually, to quote the CISO, he said, "It is the obfuscation that is throwing our competitor's name off." And because this other company was not able to remove the obfuscation, this CISO forwarded the malware to us. So, as any good researcher, I love a challenge, and I heard that some other person out there, or just a set of people, couldn't figure out what this malware was doing, I jumped on it right away. Now, it's understandable why this other company had trouble analyzing it. It is obfuscated. But unlike most malware that is obfuscated by using a packer, this malware is different. So most malware, again, uses a packer for obfuscation. And a packer compresses and encrypts the original code and data and appends an unpacking stub to the now packed malware. And at runtime, the unpacking stub decrypts and decompresses the packed code and data, then executes the unpacked code. That's the typical way it works. But it's not the case for this sample. This malware sample instead used inline code obfuscation. And that meant that there was no unpacking stub. Obfuscated code, or junk code, was mixed in directly with the legitimate code. Now let's take a look and see what that looked like. Here is a snippet of the disassembly of a single function from the malware. Now you can see in the disassembly several random looking 32-bit values getting assigned to various stack variables, and you can see mathematical operations being applied to these values. But the truth is, a lot of this code that we're looking at in this snippet is junk code. It actually isn't semantically relevant to the functionality of the malware, but there is some code in here that is legitimate. Well, if we took time to analyze it, we would find that var10 and var18 are used for junk code, and var4 and varc, the stack variables, are used for legitimate code. So I know what you're thinking, though. You're thinking, Jason, come on, it's 2013, nobody reads x86 assembly code anymore. That's why we have hexrays. We decompile everything. Surely the hexrays decompilation will be a lot easier to read. Well, maybe yes and maybe no. So this is the hexrays decompilation of the entire function that snippet was from. And you can see, just at first glance, it's still not immediately obvious what's going on in this function. And this is a relatively short function. But we can try to remove this junk code manually. Well, we can start by making some assumptions. We can assume that the input arguments, A1, A2, and A3, are all legitimate variables. And we see that, for example, the first line of code is saying that stack variable v10 is getting set to the value in function argument A1. Well, if we're going to assume that A1, A2, and A3, the input arguments, are all legitimate variables, then we can also make the assumption that all local stack variables that are tainted by legitimate variables or values are also legitimate. So that means that, let's see, v10 is getting set to what A1 was, v8 is getting set to what A3 is, and we can tag each of these variables as legitimate. Now if we do this, you can see that A1, A2, and A3 are okay, as is v10, as is v8, etc. And after we've tagged all of the values that have been tainted by other legitimate variables and keep reiterating this process until we find no new legitimate variables, we do end up with this. And if we remove all the lines of decompilation that don't contain legitimate instructions, we end up with this. Now this is actually much more readable than what we had originally, but there are over 1,000 functions in this malware sample, and it would be very time consuming to do this manually for every function. So, as with any good computer science person would do, I automated it. I wrote a hexraise plugin to do this for me. Well, what does this hexraise plugin do? Well, it pretty much follows the steps that we followed manually. It starts off by finding all basic legitimate variables. And those legitimate variables are function arguments to the current function. Global variables are considered to be legitimate. Arguments to function calls from the function are considered legitimate, as are return values from any function calls made from inside the function. And optionally, the plugin allows you to say that local function variables used in return statements are also legitimate. And what the plugin does after it determines all these legitimate variables and all the other stack variables that are tainted by these legitimate variables, it goes through and prunes the decompilation graph to remove the junk code. So I just mentioned the decompilation graph. Let's take a look and see what the decompilation graph looks like for the original decompilation. So 117 nodes. That's actually a lot of nodes in a decompilation graph for a relatively simple function. For what's worth, the function that we're analyzing here just initializes a one-time pad. After running the plugin for hexraise to decompile this, to rather deobfuscate this decompilation graph, we end up with 71 nodes. That's a 39% reduction for this sample function. So let's take a look at this in action. Okay, so here I have my original function, and in this instance of IDA, the hexraise plugin is not installed. And by the way, the name of the hexraise plugin that we're releasing is called Crowd Detox. So in this instance of IDA, Crowd Detox is not installed. And if we press F5 to decompile it, we see again that original obfuscated decompilation. However, if you look at the second instance of IDA, the Crowd Detox plugin is installed here. And if we decompile it here, you can see that all the junk is removed automatically. We don't have to do anything. And the good news is that this plugin that we're releasing not only works for this function, and of course every other function in this binary, but it works for any binary out there. It's not specific to this family. The approach we use and the assumptions we make for removing junk code can really be applied to any software out there that uses inline junk instructions. Now the good news is that Crowd Detox, this hexraise plugin, is both free and open source, and it's available right now. You can go to crowdstrike.com/community tools to download it, both the binary and the source code, and have fun with it. I hope it helps. Okay, so that was the code obfuscation. But code obfuscation wasn't the only aspect of this malware. It also used data obfuscation. In fact, this malware contained no human-readable registry keys, file names, server addresses, or URI paths. And the reason is that all of the strings are used for this functionality are decrypted at runtime. And if we look at the code, this is actually the decompiled, or rather the deobfuscated decompiled code. We can see some snippets here. We see an API call to reg open key A that would normally take as input, the second argument, an ASCII string. And LP subkey we see is assigned on the line above. It's the return value of sub 407F90. And as input, that function takes data from 4391D8. Now if we look at 43198 on the right side of the screen, we see a list of seemingly random bytes. But if we look at 407F90, we can see that this is a function that actually performs string decryption. It copies the input string, or the input byte array, to the heap, and then it does an XOR on the string using a previously prepared one-time XOR pad. Now, those of you familiar with incident response know that when dealing with incidents, time is of the essence. So, within the first hour, we managed to find that decryption function for the strings, identify the list of all the encrypted strings, patched the binary such that instead of decrypting the strings on the heap, the strings were decrypted rather, in place, and patched the binary with some handwritten assembly to call this string decryption function on every encrypted string in the sample. And once we did all that, we were able to create snort rules and notify the customer of potential indications of compromise as soon as we could. But obviously, this is a little time consuming, and given that this malware sample is just one variant of a larger family, and we want to analyze other variants, we can't really rely on this type of manual process for every sample. Ideally, what we want to do is to be able to statically deobfuscate all of the data, and then automate that for processing. So that's what we investigated, actually. It turns out that the string decryption is done via an XOR, and the length of the one-time pad is encrypted. It's actually decrypted at runtime via an XOR with a hard-coded cryptographic seed. And the one-time pad's content is generated via bit shifts and rotations, additions and multiplications. And here it is. If you're looking to write your own DGA for nefarious purposes, first of all, please don't, but this is how this malware did it. As for decrypting the strings, you can see it is just a basic XOR decryption. In this sample code here, this high-level code, beginning of strings is the beginning of the first string in the set of encrypted strings, and length of one-time pad happens to also be the length of all the encrypted strings combined. So that's it for the code obfuscation and the data obfuscation. Now initially, we collected over 100 variants from this malware family after doing our initial analysis. And we found that most of the variants used randomized strings in its decrypted data for file names, directory names, and registry names. However, there were a few variants that we spotted that didn't use randomized strings. Instead, they used what we're calling template placeholders, or template data. So as it turns out, 132 of the 148 variants that we collected used randomized data, but 16 used these template variants. And my guess is that the malware author had originally written the malware to use the template variants and then wrote the next version to use the randomized variables, so the randomized values. So these 16 that we found maybe weren't supposed to be let into the wild. So we did research on the P timestamps. They do appear to be legitimate based on when those samples were first found on sites like VirusTotal. And based on the P timestamps for all of these samples, the malware appears to have first been built and distributed in February of 2013. So here's a bucketed graph of the samples that we initially collected. You can see that they appear to first be built on February 2nd, and then there was a 3-day lull. And then again, there's some more that are built on February 5th, but all around the same hour of day. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we do at CrowdStrike is try to do intelligence research to find out who wrote the malware that we look at. So let's investigate that a bit. There's some clues in these decrypted strings, in these template strings for the non-randomized variants. It turns out that all variants using that template have the same exact seed value. It's not randomized. They all use a seed value 445A4950. And if we try to parse that as ASCII, we get the word peased. Now, peased is a relatively common word in Eastern Europe, and actually in many languages, it translates to the word pussy. But we're not stuck at that. We're not stuck at saying, well, maybe the author was Croatian, maybe he or she spoke Polish. There are more clues that we have. So it turns out that the template string for the malware's file name copy is Pula o sug I un gut, or XCSCQWS that. And that loosely translates from Romanian, not the other languages, but Romanian only, loosely translates to English as suck a dick in your throat. But it's really not how Romanians would say that phrase. A Romanian is much more likely to say suge pula un gut. Instead, pula o sug I un gut is more likely the wording that a Romani would use. And if you're not familiar with the term Romani, Romani people are also known as gypsies. Furthermore, a Romanian is much more likely to say the word pizda than peased, whereas a Romani would say peased. So all signs so far would suggest that the malware author may very well have spoken Romani. Now again, I'm not saying he was definitely Romani. Sure, some nation-state adversary could have put this together to try to mislead us to make it look like it was a Romani author. But so far, things would suggest that the author is Romani. But that's not actually all there is. There's actually another set of strings that strongly suggest a Romani author. So the template strings for the directory name and registry value names are Nicolae Guța, XZ, and Costi Ionita, QWS. And the template string used in entry point obfuscation is Adrian Copilul Minune Si Florin Salam. And all four of these guys are Manele singers, very prominent Romani Manele singers. Again, further suggesting that the malware appears to have been written by someone who is Romani and or likes Romani culture a lot. Oh, and by the way, Romania is in time zone UTC +2, so we're looking at those P timestamps earlier. Those times would suggest that the local P build times were from 8 p.m. to midnight in Romania, which isn't an unreasonable time for a malware author to be busy at work. All right, this talk obviously though is based on, or is really focused on domain generating algorithms, so let's dive into that. Now, all variants of this malware contain the same exact list of 384 words. And to create the domain names that the DGA uses, it uses an algorithm to pseudo-randomly select 2 words from this list, concatenate them together, and add .net to the end. And here's the list of 384 words. Now, as I just said, it combines 2 of these words together to make a domain name. And 384 squared, anyone? No? No, okay. No one got it. 147,456 possible domain names. That would be a lot to monitor. The good news is that the pseudo-random algorithm uses only 15 bits of the seed value. So there are actually only 32,000 possible domain names. The seed value is calculated using the number of seconds that have elapsed since the beginning of 1970 and divides that by 512, leading to a granularity of 8.5 minutes. And the malware tries 85 different domains per seed value, creating a sliding window of DGA domains, and that means that each domain is in this window for 7.5 hours before the window advances past that domain. So here's the high-level code for the function that actually generates the host name. This is a C#-based reinterpretation of the DGA algorithm. A hex host name, A helper table, and A host strings are all hard-coded data arrays in the malware that are encrypted in the same manner that the strings are encrypted. And these arrays that are hard-coded are actually the same in every single variant. So every variant out there generates the same domains at the same time, no matter what computer they're running on or what variant of the malware they're running. Now, once the malware generates the domain name it wants to use, it connects to, or tries to connect to those domains and tries to send this GET request. And each malware variant contains a hard-coded email address. And we're going to talk about those email addresses more soon. Now, the malware takes the response from the server and checks to see if it contains a certain fingerprint. And if it does, the malware makes a second request to the server, same exact request, nothing changed, and the second response, again if it contains the correct fingerprint, causes the malware to download that response, save it as an executable, and execute it. Now we were interested to see what the spread of this malware looked like and where the infections might have been concentrated. So we did some sinkholing. We set up 5 domains to which the DJ would resolve from March 5th through March 9th. And we received about 15,000 hits from computers all around the world. And when I say hits, I don't mean just random computers pinging our server, just trying to do basic GET requests. These hits, these 15,000 hits, were all hits with using the GET request with the format I just showed you in the previous slide. So these are actually infected systems that were hitting our sinkholes. And we logged almost 1,200 unique client IP addresses, and exactly, believe it or not, 1,000 unique email addresses that were posted to the sinkhole servers, meaning that there are at least 1,000 variants of the malware out there, since each malware sample, each malware variant, has its own unique hard-coded email address in it. And of these 1,000 unique email addresses, there were 286 unique email address domains. To show you a graph of the sinkhole activity, here it is. You can see it really focusing on the 5 days that we were running the sinkhole servers, or that we were rather prepared for the registrations for the strike times. And you can see there were probably some infected computers out there with system clocks that were a little off, and we got a little trickle of a few hits after that 5-day period. Now I mentioned the email addresses that we were receiving that were posted to our sinkhole server. This is what some of them look like. This is obviously a very small collection of them, but we see 1-800-Flowers at 1-800-Reminders.com, consultant fiscal unsubscribe at yahoogroups.com, FB message plus something at facebookmail.com. Well, it looks like there's another malware component out there that harvests infected systems inboxes, email inboxes, to create these malware variants and then send it out. Some other interesting statistics for the email addresses that we saw that were posted to our sinkhole servers. There's a disproportionately high number of yahoo.com email addresses. Keep that in mind, we're going to come back to that soon. And there's also a disproportionately low number of gmail.com addresses. 0, in fact. So it's possible that this second malware component that we had not yet seen actually ignores gmail.com addresses, maybe because they don't want the Gmail team at Google spotting and identifying this malware campaign. But of course, that's just a guess. So I mentioned that we were interested in the spread of this malware, where it might be concentrated. And if we plot out all of the IP addresses from around the world where we were getting hits, this is what the top 10 countries were sending us. So the United States was definitely at the top of the list, but second is Romania. And Romania does definitely not have the second highest population of people or computers in the world. So this would further suggest that the malware author might be living in Romania, or maybe the initial targets were Romanian targets, but certainly is an interesting piece of data. But sinkholing isn't all that we did when it came to investigating the domains that were generated. We also did monitoring of these domains and developed automation to connect to each DJ domain in real time as the malware would connect to it and try to download from it. And actually, we did this automation connecting to these domains through Tor. And give myself a little plug, if you want to learn more about ways to automate things and route them through Tor, come to my talk at 3:30 in Augustus 5 and 6. Okay, so we ran this automation for 2 weeks, and we detected 20 domains that were connected to this campaign. 19 of these 20 domains were all registered via Yahoo Inc.'s small business hosting plan and all registered with yahoo.com email accounts. And remember, we saw yahoo.com is very prevalent for email addresses that were infected earlier, or that were spread to. And we saw one of the 20 domains was registered via and hosted by Omnis Network, and it was registered with an AOL.com account. Now, of these 20 domains, all of them were registered within 48 hours of the strike time. And we found identical registrant names and addresses used for several of the domains, so there was a lot of overlap amongst them. And there were semi-randomized phone numbers as well, corresponding to city area codes based on the registrant addresses. So let's take a look at some of them. You can see I color-coded ones that were identical for addresses. Now, I did some open source research on these names and addresses, on these registrant addresses, and it turns out that these names and addresses correspond to real people who really live at these residential addresses. But the phone numbers are junk and the email addresses are bogus as well. But because these names and mailing addresses are legitimate, the assumption then is that these domains were registered with stolen credit card numbers that belonged to these individuals. Now, we also did more research in terms of all the domains that could be generated. So 7 of these 20 domains hosted blank root pages during our Whois research. And 3 of them were taken down before we got to them. But 10 of them, half, hosted content for Global Partners Hungaria KFT. And by the way, Hungaria KFT translates to a Hungarian LLC. So let's take a look at the homepage for Global Partners Hungaria KFT. Work at home 1 hour a day, earn $10,000 a month. No expense. That sounds like a pretty good deal. Now, of course, those of you familiar with cybercrime will immediately recognize this as a money mule campaign. It's pretty obvious. Well, let's look at the About page. We see some messages from prominent people at Global Partners Hungaria KFT. We see Aristides P. Panagiotis, the chairman of the board of directors, saying something to potential investors or people who apply to this site. However, Aristides P. Panagiotis, that photo is actually a photo of Socrates Kokalis, chairman and CEO of Intercom Holdings, and we're able to find that out by searching for that image and finding who this photo really was of. What about the second guy? Petros Tsouratis, managing director of Global Partners. Well, it turns out the real name of Petros Tsouratis is, well, it's Petros Tsouratis, that is his real name. But he doesn't really work for Global Partners, KFT. He works for Intracat, a subsidiary of Intercom Holdings. What about the logo at the top, the logo for Global Partners, KFT? Hard to believe, I know, but it is actually the logo from Intracat's website. So, and by the way, I should mention that even though Petros Tsouratis, that is the real name of that guy, the name for the chairman, Aristides P. Panagiotis, did some research. Closest thing we could find is that there is an Aris Papadopoulos Panagiotis, who's a student in the German language department in the College of International Management and Business at the Budapest Business School. So, interesting point. Okay, well, so we didn't just look at these 20 domains though, we scanned all of them. looking for all the possible domains that could be generated by the DGA for the string global partners. And that allowed us to find 44 more domains for a total of 64 altogether. And all of them, except for 2, were registered through yahoo.com's small business hosting plan. And all 64 are registered for exactly 1 year before the strike time. And the oldest domain was registered on February 3rd, the day after the malware's PE build times first began. And these were also scanned via Tor. So, of these 44 new domains, what did these domain registrants look like? Well, the email addresses used to register these domains primarily fell into 4 categories. We found these patterns. Either the email address related to the name of the domain's registrant. So for example, if the likely stolen credit card was from Marco Soriano, we actually found a few domains registered to marcosoriano21 at yahoo.com. Or we found patterns where the email address was related to the name of another domain's registrant, which was likely a mistake by the adversary. We found email addresses, of course, related to the domain name. So the registration for degreeanimal.net was registered by degreeanimal at yahoo.com. We also found cases where the domain name was registered, was related to another domain. So for example, nightwagon.net was registered by degreeanimal at yahoo.com. And likely that was either a mistake by the attacker or the attacker just being lazy, thinking I don't want to register another email address for this campaign. So using all this information, we did some more open source research, and we found many non-DGA domains also used in this campaign. We found 14 actually. And if we look at the about page for, let's say, antaragroup.org, it's our old friends, Socrates and Petros. Doing a little more research, we find out that this has actually been going on for a while, and there's an anti-fraud site, bobbear.co.uk, that has been documenting these sites as part of this campaign for quite some time. I'm sure you recognize the layouts and the colors and the logo on these other sites that are actually not even part of domains generated by this DGA algorithm. So, investigating further, we find that this campaign goes all the way back to 2007. And you know what? It even continued after we finished our research. So, we were doing our research primarily in February. Global Partners was the malware that we saw. Well, we found 2 more that actually happened just a month later. So it's very, very active. So you're probably thinking, well, Jason, given how active this seems to be, surely it is, antivirus companies have been looking at this pretty seriously and taking it as a legitimate family. Well, maybe not. So it seems pretty evident that the malware very likely began circulating in February of 2013, and we were analyzing it in February and March. 4 months after the malware started spreading in the wild, Avast discovered a variant of it and blogged about it. So better late than never for sure. We were also interested to see which antivirus engines treated this as a unique family of malware as opposed to just having a generic signature detected. So I mentioned earlier I used to work at Microsoft on their antivirus team. And in the antivirus industry, typically, malware that really appears to be just one-off malware and not part of any larger set of malware or larger campaign, antivirus researchers will just name it something like agent or generic or Trojan. Only if the malware seems to be part of a larger campaign does that family of malware get its own unique name. So I looked on VirusTotal to see, for all these variants from this entire family, what antivirus engines detected it when it was submitted to VirusTotal, and how they detect it when it was submitted to VirusTotal. Well, it turns out that almost all of these AV companies used generic names to detect it, meaning that they didn't fully recognize that this was part of a larger campaign going on. We see agent, we see generic, we see genetic from Panda. It's an interesting name. I tried to find information on Zusi, but I couldn't find information on it on GData, Bitdefender, or F-Secure's website. So I'm going to guess that it's generic, or at least not important enough for them to write up anything about it. Artemis is a generic detection name from McAfee, as is Reputation from Symantec. It kills me. Oh, it kills the mic too. It kills me to know that my former company, Microsoft, only detected 15% of the samples when they were submitted to VirusTotal. But I am happy to see that every single variant that Microsoft detected was detected by the unique family name Suppobox. There are actually no variants that Microsoft detected that were detected as anything else. So Microsoft did spot this and did create a new unique family name for this malware family. This Suppobox signature was released by Microsoft on April 6th, 2013, 2 months after the malware began circulating. And no big surprise for anyone here, I'm sure, ClaimAV didn't detect anything. Okay, so that brings us to our conclusion here. So what can we say after all this research? Well, it appears that the malware was very likely written by a Romani, probably male, and he appears to be working with this long-running European money mule crime syndicate. There's some other component out there that we've not come across yet that appears to generate this malware based on email addresses that are found on an infected system and then send out this generated malware. And it looks like the domains behind this DGA campaign are registered using stolen credit cards. And last but not least, I showed you Crowd Detox, a new free open source plugin for X-rays that can be used to more easily analyze decompiled code. So I'm happy to take any questions, but before I do, I want to give special thanks to Alex Ionescu for helping with the Romanian translations. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, please, so raise your hand, and the proctor here will be happy to hand you a microphone.
Hey, thank you for the talk. So you mentioned that this is a downloader, and there's another variant that harvests email addresses, and as you monitored or scanned the domains, what did you see as actual commands, and what are the capabilities of that? I mean, if it's only a downloader, what did it typically drop, if at all, anything? And what are the capabilities of the subsequent binaries?
So if I understand the question is effectively, what malware did this downloader download? It turns out, through all the monitoring we did, we didn't get a single executable downloaded by following the exact same pattern of requests that the malware sends out. So it's unclear right now why that was the case, but in all of our monitoring, we didn't see any executables being downloaded by this malware, even from domains that did send back the correct fingerprints on the first reply. So it's a mystery still.
Okay, just to follow up, so the earlier campaigns that you saw, like the similar websites and stuff that is not related to this particular DGA variant, were there any specific things they were after, like other than harvesting email addresses, maybe collecting some credit card information, but like other goals they're after? Like what is what is this money mule group typically doing to people?
So the question is, the previous campaigns before this DGA malware that we analyzed here, what were those campaigns likely after? We did not actually research those previous domains or those previous campaigns in depth. It appears that they were trying to get people to sign up and mule money for them. As for the sources and destinations of where the money was coming from or where it was going to, it's unclear right now. But we didn't see any malware connected specifically with those previous campaigns.
Thanks.
Thank you for your questions. Another question here?
So it seems like the obvious shouldn't be the speaker. It seems like the obvious response from the malware authors to your releasing the deobfuscation tool will be to add illegitimate arguments, which will destroy your whole detainting algorithm. Do you have a plan for what to do when they do that? Because it seems to me that your algorithm's pretty dependent on that.
So you're right, the algorithm makes a lot of assumptions which could be violated by future versions of this malware or other malware. And you're absolutely right. So when it comes to reverse engineering, it's always a cat and mouse game. New packers are always coming out. New unpackers are always created by reverse engineers. And that's one of the reasons why we're releasing this to the community as open source, so that as we see new tricks being employed by the bad guys, you can counter them by modifying this open source plugin. So if they can create some type of automated tool to do this obfuscation, then surely this plugin could be updated to automatically deobfuscate it as well. Thank you for your question. Got one in the back, one here.
So I apologize, I missed the first 10 minutes or so of your talk. I'm wondering, so at what point, so just in terms of your practice of reversing malware, at what point do you know when you're done? Yeah, that's the question.
So the question is, when reverse engineering malware, at what point do you know that you're done? And the answer is it depends. It depends on what your goal is. So if you're working at an antivirus company, which CrowdStrike isn't, but if you are working at an antivirus company and your goal is just to, for the most part, churn out as many signatures as you can or as many detections as you can, then your goal isn't necessarily to understand what the malware is capable of doing. Rather, it's to actually just create a detection for it. The other extreme is if you are doing something like we're doing, which is doing a complete analysis to not only figure out the indicators of compromise of the malware, but also how to clean it up, how it spreads, how to prevent it from infecting your system, and the people behind it. So the truth is, for the most part, we look at every function that's not a library function. So we look at pretty much everything, all the code, all the data. There's nothing that really goes untouched by us when doing our analysis. We do certainly prioritize things. So typically we try to get out snort signatures and indicators of compromise as quickly as possible to our customers, in which case we'll spend maybe the first hour or two doing a very quick analysis, trying to focus in on API functions that are going to be related to its spread and its functionality, its base functionality. But in terms of everything, we typically look at everything. Yeah. Does that answer your question? So we know we're done when there are no functions left to be analyzed.
I guess I'll just follow up. I mean, there's you could probably bring theoretical computer science into this, right? If you wanted to. I mean, just because you've looked at every line of it, assembly doesn't necessarily mean you've sussed out all the functionality, right? I'm just wondering if there. I mean, this is a young field, right? Malware reverse engineering. I'm just wondering to what extent, you bring theoretical ideas or sort of formal. Accuracy measure. I'm just wondering if there's any degree of formality to the, when you're trying to rigorously analyze a sample to when you decide that, okay, this is enough, right? I have a good sense of what the sample does.
So although we do typically follow a process for analyzing malware, I wouldn't say there's a formal set of formalities that we follow to say, okay, there's certainly nothing else that this malware could do. We do dynamic analysis in addition to static analysis in case we miss something or misanalyze something. And we can definitely say, as much as we feel confident that we've analyzed it fully, it's very likely that this malware won't do anything that we've not analyzed, that we don't already understand. But there's always the potential for like you said, some assembly instruction may be being documented by Intel incorrectly and doing something that we didn't expect it to do. In practice, it's very rare that we are so surprised at the actual outcome of functionality after we've analyzed the full thing. But I would never say it's not possible, because it certainly is. But it's not a formal, in terms of computer science terminology, it's not really a formal approach or a formal guarantee. Thank you. Question up front from Ryan.
Can you tell if the obfuscation was done at the high-level language level, and were there compiler identifiers in the EXE?
Okay. So the question is, was the obfuscation likely done at the high level or after it's compiled? And are there compiler identifiers in the EXE? So for the first question, was the obfuscation inserted at compile time as opposed to after compile time? Well, I sure hope so for the sake of whoever wrote the obfuscator, because this would be a huge pain in the ass to write for it to be applied after compilation. So I can't know for sure, but I would assume it was done at the source code level. As for indicators of compiler, I'm pretty sure it was Microsoft's Visual C++. I think there were library functions from the Microsoft standard libraries, but I can follow up with you after and take a look and let you know for sure. Question in the back corner there.
Does the malware generate NX domains for the GA?
Sorry, did you ask, does the malware generate infinite domains?
No, NX domains.
Oh, NX domains. They're all, in terms of the domain record type or the
Right, do the domains actually always resolve, or typically DGA does not?
Right, no, the domains do not all resolve. Only a small set of them do. You're saying, are there DNS servers that resolve each domain that's generated?
No, well, generally, like most malware, when it has DGA, it'll be running, and then it'll generate lots of domains. Some of them actually resolve, but most of them do not.
Right.
So does this malware actually generate domains that do not resolve?
Yes, most of the domains that are generated do not resolve.
Okay.
Question down here.
Let's assume that we have a malware that actually using a polymorphic or metamorphic encryption and have also an asymmetric encryption for transferring the data to the CNC server. So it's every time it's a different hard-coded key in each sample, and it is also using DGA domain generation. So my question is how we can detect this kind of threat and prevent it?
So that can be rather difficult to do if you are only looking at it from the network side and if you haven't analyzed its DGA algorithm. If you do analyze its DGA algorithm like we did for this malware sample, then we can predict all 32,000 domains that it could generate. And if you want to put all 32,000 into your snort rules, then problem solved. As for the type of traffic it's sending, even though you wouldn't necessarily be able to, actually you wouldn't be able to determine what you're seeing from the network side, if you are hooked in on the client side, at some point the malware has to generate the clear text traffic before it works to send it out in an encrypted form. So you could hook in at that time and understand what it would be sending out. And that's for dynamic analysis. And if you're looking at statically, like you did with the DGA algorithm, to determine how that works, then you could statically determine what type of information it would be sending out to these servers anyway. As for the metamorphic and polymorphic, that would certainly could be more time consuming for the analysis, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be done. Thank you. All right, so I think we have time for one more question. Looks like there are no more questions. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and please scan your badge on the way out, and I'm giving another talk in 20 minutes in Augustus 5 and 6 on tortilla. Hope to see you there for that. Thank you.